Hello. Our adventure continues inside the Phantom, a separate, smaller ship that was a part of the Ghost. The Phantom was full of Jedi, and instead of there being 4 Jedi, there were now 3. Ahsoka, while not exactly being a Jedi, was one of the 4 of them who came here to Malachor. The 4 of them encountered the 3 Inquisitors, a shadow of the relic of the past, and Darth Vader himself. Ezra, Kanan, and Titus had encountered Vader before, each of them barely surviving their encounter with the Dark Lord of the Sith. A terrible series of events occurred just moments before as Titus piloted away, not knowing any of what had happened, aside from what he had just seen at the end of the fight. When the Phantom got into hyperspace, he turned around and looked blankly at the back of the ship, the image playing out in his mind over and over again. Ahsoka forced pushing Ezra and Kanan away from the closing doors as she fought Vader. Nothing could be said of her survival or that of the Dark Lord of the Sith, but there was no positive way of looking at it. Titus shook the memory from his mind as he got up and walked over to Kanan and Ezra. Their bond as master and apprentice had been shaken, and that was mostly due to the interaction between Ezra and Maul. The former apprentice to Darth Sidious convinced Ezra to work with him. The young Jedi wasn't old enough to know who Maul was, and so he was dissuaded from the short-term training he received by Kanan. Ezra felt immeasurable guilt for everything, not just the incident involving Maul, but the loss of Ahsoka, and the one thing Titus hadn't immediately noticed yet. Kanan was currently wearing a mask of a Jedi Temple guard. He hadn't seen one since the last time he was inside the temple, nearly 20 years beforehand. Titus then learned that Kanan was blinded by Maul. The aging Sith did it in an effort to kill the Jedi Master and take Ezra for his own. Ezra was a special force user and Titus knew that, though he understood the importance of allowing Kanan to make mistakes along the way. Titus represented a teacher in a way, but he was more so an observer. Sure, he trained Katuni, and while she had passed away to Luna almost 10 years beforehand, the wound still sat fresh in his heart. Titus met Ezra only 6 years after he left Earth, and he knew that the boy was special. In a way, Ezra reminded him of his little sister. A lot of potential, but all that power wasn't correctly placed. It wasn't correlated, and it took away from Ezra in a way. Though there were continuous stages over the past 2 years of knowing Ezra that he noticed a very unique force ability with the young Jedi. Ezra had an incredible connection to animals. It's as if he spoke their language. Ezra showed a lot of connection with Purrgil and Lothal cats. An odd combination, but that's all he noticed up until this point. When the trio included Chopper returned to Chopper Base on Atalan, the failure was fed across the Ghost crew. Rex lost Ahsoka, Kanan lost his vision, and Ezra had himself a Sith holocron that he was keeping hidden. Titus stood on the Phantom next to Chopper as everyone left. He looked around and then moved back to the Ghost to think about the events of what had just transpired. He was unaware that Ezra was still clutching on to a Sith holocron. For the past 2 years, Titus had helped Kanan with his training of Ezra, but at this point he had backed off enough to allow Kanan to continue on his own. Titus didn't feel like he had to interject in the training at this point because Kanan became a confident teacher, and despite the wound to his eyes, Titus assumed that Kanan would continue to train Ezra. He was wrong. The rebel cells were starting to jump, and Titus, having been with the Ghost crew for almost a decade, was heavily focused on assisting the rebels. He helped situate the rebel base on Earth inside of the Messina System. It was one of the best placed in the entire galaxy for the rebellion to hide at. For the most part, the rebel fleet was located there, and the rebels here on Atalan were actively going into the galaxy on missions. Titus, having been a commander during the Clone Wars, naturally fit into the role of commander here alongside General Syndulla. The best part for Titus was getting along with Rex, Hera, and Kanan, and they all had a level of similarity with each other, something they could all relate to. Titus was the oldest of the bunch, being nearly 10 years older than both Kanan and Hera, but the situation with the Ghost crew was still situated in which Hera was the leader of the squad as Spectre too. Titus, despite the blinding of Kanan, understood he had responsibilities to the rebellion, and he began acting on missions for the rebels. One of the most crucial of the bunch was aiding a rebel cell being operated by the former Senator Mon Mothma on the planet of Yavin 4. This kept Titus away from Chopper Base. It was an entirely secret operation, and aside from Titus and Hera, no one knew about it. Hera wanted Titus on Yavin because she as well as Titus assumed that Ezra and Kanan would continue to get along, but their relationship got rocky. While Titus was on Yavin, Ezra began to delve into the Sith holocron he and Maul acquired on Malachor. The issue is Ezra believed he was using the holocron for the right reasons. While yes, it was giving him short-term results in the form of new powers and even greater powers, it was leading him down a dark path, slowly coaxing him to the dark side of the Force. Kanan was nowhere to be seen during this time. Well, he was just not present to anyone else's life, as he was simply just sitting out of the way, meditating for the most part, and getting used to his new life as a blinded man. He had the Force as his ally, and he was at total peace with his new struggle. Kanan never blamed Ezra for what had happened on Malachor, though he never explicitly said anything about it to Ezra, so that his young student or apprentice would know about it. Without masters in the form of Titus or Kanan, Ezra began to fall off the deep end, and almost becoming obsessed with the dark side. It gave him the ability to grow in the Force more than he had ever before. On Yavin, Titus admitted it. He missed his friends. They were his everything, his family if anything. Kanan, Hera, Zeb, Sabine, Chopper, and Ezra. He loved all of them. Something so rare for a Jedi to feel, but is how he felt now. He was so removed from the Jedi at this point in his life that he felt no need to be loyal to a code that no longer existed. It was the weirdest thing for him. Titus, despite having to kill his sister, realized a lot about his life after spending time with the Ghost crew. And here on Yavin 4 without them, he realized how much of his heart they filled up. All their missions, their silly adventures, their goofy conversations, their late night talks, all of it. Titus was seated up against several layers on the top of the massive ancient structures on Yavin, and he couldn't help but wonder how his friends were doing. He had a little hologram he liked to play over and over again. It was a recording Chopper made from when the Ghost crew finally fleshed itself out. Kanan and Hera were sitting down in the main cabin of the Ghost. Sabine was spray painting a phoenix symbol on the wall, while Zeb and Ezra were picking a playful fight with each other. When Titus walked in, everyone's faces lit up. It was the same expression Titus had when he walked in. They were all one family, and that was what made them so beautiful. Titus watched the hologram as he patted Ezra on the head and sat down on the opposite side of the table. His arm hung over the edge as he asked what Sabine was making. She moved out of the way to show him his symbol, to which Titus congratulated her on its progress. She told him that she thought it would be the final iteration of the drawing. Titus smiled and turned over to look at Chopper, Zeb, and Ezra. The hologram recording ended there. But inside of Titus's mind, the story continued. Chopper zapped Ezra, but missed and instead zapped Zeb. Ezra and Chopper laughed as a massive Lasat raged and chased the little C-1 droid and the boy out of the ship. Titus remembered the smell of it, like it was yesterday. He could feel the beautiful breeze trickle in from the exterior of the Ghost, while they were situated inside of the fields of Lothal. Titus looked at the moons above Yavin 4 and a tear slid down his cheek. Yavin had 20 plus moons, but only 6 of them were visible. He spoke to himself, pointing to each of the visible moons, calling them Hera, Kanan, Chopper, Zeb, Sabine, and Ezra. Titus leaned his head back against the wall and ripped a tear away from his face. When the morning came, it was time for him to ship off. Cassian Andor had just returned from a mission he had off-world, and he brought back a group of rebel fighters, one of them being Kino Loy. Mon Mothma told Titus that she was thankful for his hard work in helping them set up the base for the past couple of months. She was dispatching him elsewhere in the galaxy to help relocate former members of the Path. At this point, Titus was fully aware of the Path. He knew about Obi-Wan's sacrifice after the Battle of Jabim. Of course, no one knew if Vader killed Kenobi or not, but his heroics inspired the people to continue their fight. With rebel cells forming an alliance, they were trying to piece together each separate rebel cell that had ideals and beliefs that didn't involve senseless murder. It's what separated the floundering alliance from the Saw Gerrera insurgents. So another couple months passed by where Titus couldn't see his family. He got to speak to them from time to time, though for the most part it was just his good friend Hera. She admitted the difficulties the crew was having, especially the tension between Ezra and Kanan, though Titus reassured her that the time would come where Ezra and Kanan would rebuild their bond. It would become stronger than it ever was before, and it would assist each of them in fulfilling their missions to their friends and to the galaxy as Jedi. Hera was thankful for her friends' help. Titus often asked about his other friends, and they were all doing good, as per usual, and when Hera asked about the Alliance, it wasn't as positive as even Hera would have liked to hear. The Rebel Alliance was struggling. There were pieces coming together, and thanks to the secret base in the Messina System, the rebels were able to build up a little bit of a fleet, but it was nothing massive or even formidable at that. The largest contributor to the fleet was a ship manned by Admiral Raddus, which was an MC-75. The Mon Calamari cruiser was the only vessel that could go toe-to-toe with a Star Destroyer, though if it were more than one Star Destroyer, it would definitely struggle. Regardless, when Titus was able to return to Topper Base, he found that there was some difference. Ezra and Kanan had sorted out their little issues, and the rebels were pushing back against the Empire, but one of the crew members was missing. Sabine ended up getting a hold of a legendary Darksaber, and after training with Ezra and Kanan, she returned to her people on Chronist. Titus's return was welcomed with open arms. Something that Titus was hard to grasp, it was how much Ezra had grown since he was last here in Atalon. Ezra was now leading missions. He crafted a new lightsaber with an emerald glow, and his hair was cut very short. He'd grown so much in a short period of time, and it made Titus reflect upon his own experience with Ketouni, making him wonder what would have been had she survived to this day. On another note, Titus was informed about the biggest challenge that the rebels out here were facing, and it was in the form of Grand Admiral Thrawn. He was tracking them down by using their last known coordinates and possible locations they could jump to from those coordinates. The rebels of course didn't know this, but Hera knew that he would be their toughest challenge. Not that Vader wasn't more than enough for 3 Jedi and Ahsoka, but Thrawn was a genius tactician. Vader was impatient. The significant difference here is that Thrawn would be mounting up his own grand attack on the rebels, whereas Vader would have used his Inquisitors. After Titus was debriefed, Kanan came up to him and asked him to follow him. Titus agreed and followed Kanan to a random location surrounded by large trees and plants. There were a number of Atalan spiders around them. They were called Kinika. Though Titus didn't have an issue with facing these animals, there were a number of wild animals on Earth that he faced when he was with Ketouni, and he found the same thing to be true with them. The Force flowed through every living being, and if he remained calm, the animals would remain calm as well. Of course, he could be hunted, but there were very few carnivorous animals on Earth that tried to hunt him. This was the same with these large animals. They would only attack if they were provoked to attack. When Kanan stopped, Titus stopped. Kanan got down on his knees, and the ground began to rumble. Titus looked up, and his eyes widened when the great Bendu made himself visible. The two of them locked eyes, and the great Bendu called Titus by his full name. Titus's jaw swung down, watching the magnificent size of the creature rise. The essence in the Force from the Bendu was warm, it was peaceful. There was not a hint of darkness, almost too pure. The Bendu asked Titus where he had been, to which he explained he was out on a mission on behalf of the Alliance. The Bendu shook his head. That wasn't the answer he was looking for. Bendu knew that Titus hadn't been himself for a little while. It started after Malachor. His inability to look past the past was holding him back. Titus frowned. He knew what the Bendu was referring to. The answer Bendu wanted was what he already knew. Titus looked down at Kanan, who didn't move a muscle. He was so intertwined with the Force, and his blindness encouraged Kanan to be the embodiment of a true Jedi Knight. Titus looked back up and told Bendu that he felt guilt for the passing of Ahsoka. Bendu looked up into the sky and smiled, telling Titus that there was no guilt that needed to be felt. Titus didn't understand, and he didn't need to. Ahsoka had truly never died. It's as the Force wills, and she had been saved by Ezra, yet Ezra hadn't done that yet in his own life. It was just bound to happen through the Force. Ahsoka had already lived something that couldn't be understood until Ezra entered the world between worlds. Bendu knew as the Force did, and as Ahsoka did, that she should have perished at the hands of her former master, having been saved by the will of the Force, of course. Her journey not yet complete, and Ezra saving her was the will of the Force that permitted her to continue on her journey. Bendu wouldn't tell this to Titus. It wasn't his place to know that yet. Though the great Bendu did want to know why Titus relinquished himself from his purpose. Titus didn't know what that meant either, to which Bendu explained that Titus was meant to do more than wither away, lost in the past. Titus rebuted this, telling Bendu that he wasn't stuck in the past, he just missed his friends when they were away from him. Bendu made his motion towards Titus, making his face much larger in the eyes of Titus. He spoke to Titus, telling him that there were more than just missing friends, there was something lacking. Titus wasn't admitting to it because he didn't want to accept the reality of the situation. Bendu knew it too, so he asked Titus to admit it to himself. Titus looked away and told Bendu that he was reluctant to be what the rebels needed him to be a leader, to be a commander again. Sure, he fell naturally back into it. He was a commander during the Clone Wars after all, but without his former master it didn't feel right. Without the clones it felt like betrayal. He didn't want to see his friends suffer. They were all great people. All of them had the intentions of the others in their mind, but sometimes it was hard. Sometimes Titus couldn't escape his own feelings of failure for what happened to Ketouni, to Lugnut, to Master Usk, and most of all what happened to his poor sister Luna. He was meant to look after her and she fell so far. Titus didn't want to imagine what could have happened to the others in his life. Ever since he met Kanan, Hera, and Chopper, he had some of the best years of his life aside from the time he had raising Ketouni. He didn't want it to come crashing down in a heroic end or a terrible desolation. Bendu told Titus that he couldn't control the fates of others. His purpose in life was to help. Titus didn't quite understand, and the truth is, he wouldn't understand till it was all said and done. He wouldn't have the answers until he himself looked in the eyes of the one true Force. Titus didn't know how to accept this, but Bendu told him it was time to let go of his reluctance to assist. It's not that Titus didn't participate, he helped his friends on several missions, but as things got more tense, he began to close himself off, opting to take the safer mission, and when they lost Ahsoka, he felt it the hardest. Titus had a great bond with Ahsoka. She was someone who, like Kanan, understood him. She served during the Clone Wars, and she served with Skywalker himself. But the thing that got Titus and Ahsoka tightly bonded was their understanding of the Force. Ahsoka had a much different experience, being one of the only users since the era of the High Republic to heal lightsaber crystals. The two of them spent hours discussing the Force and how they understood it, the mythology of the Force, if you will. And when he lost her, he closed himself off. Not entirely from the Force, but in a way, from the Force. In his age, his naive optimism dissipated, and his mature optimism was crushed by the apparent death of Ahsoka. Though what Bendu suggested might be true. Maybe he was more than just a shadow, and maybe he should be more active where he previously was not. If he was needed, then he was needed. So Titus returned to his friends, accompanying them in undercover missions and recon missions. This was until the Empire found a Talon and targeted Chopra Base. This first encounter with Grand Admiral Thrawn would tell Titus everything he needed to know, that this individual needed to be stopped, no matter the sacrifice. Thrawn could very easily disrupt the balance of everything. If he was smart enough to outsmart Hera Syndulla, who was one of the best, if not the best strategist in the Alliance, then he was their greatest threat. Though when the rebels were pinned down after losing part of their fleet and Captain Sato, the great Bendu used his powers to sacrifice himself for the rebels. He knew what would become of them. He knew the role all these individuals had, whether it be Hera Syndulla, Captain Rex, Titus, Kanan, or Ezra. They all had a greater role in the change the galaxy needed. They just hadn't seen it yet. After the loss of Chopper Base, the rebels would relocate to Yavin 4 and begin staging operations with the Ghost crew on the planet of Lothal. The beginning of the end of the fight for Lothal would begin. Ghost would uncover on the planet and learn that the Empire was destroying the planet, killing people and putting the rest under subjugation. For months, the rebels would stay on Lothal, working undercover, disrupting Grand Admiral Thrawn's personal project, the TIE Defender, and saving Hera Syndulla, who was captured by the Empire. During the rescue, Kanan Jarrus would sacrifice his life for the Ghost crew in a heroic moment of love and compassion. The most incredible part is Kanan had his sight restored by the Force when he did so. He was able to save his friends in his own grand sacrifice for the greater good. Kanan's sacrifice helped destroy the entire fuel depot on Lothal, which put an end and a nail in the coffin for Grand Admiral Thrawn's TIE Defender project. The death would be painful for the rebels, but it would cost the Empire invaluable resources for what would have arguably destroyed the rebel forces. With the death of Kanan on their minds, some of the rebels, notably Sabine and Zeb, would go out of their way to cause carnage, which would lead to the rebels being discovered by the bounty hunter of sorts hired by Thrawn to find the rebels. Over the course of a couple weeks, the rebels would be able to fight back against the Empire, and it would lead to Grand Admiral Thrawn bombarding the capital city of Lothal. In a final daring move by the Ghost crew, they would try to stop Thrawn. The siege of Lothal would come to an end with the death of the great clone commander, Gregor, and the worst part of the battle was the loss of the other Jedi. Ezra would follow in his master's footsteps as Kanan followed in his, creating a self-sacrifice. The last the Ghost crew would see is a herd of Purrgil jumping off into lightspeed after grabbing hold of Thrawn's flagship, the Chimera, and disappearing. The entire Imperial fleet would be destroyed. The Imperial structure that was maintaining operation over the capital would be jettisoned, and Grand Admiral Thrawn would be completely removed from the sequence of events that came next. The most incredible part of the sacrifice was that the people of Lothal feared the Empire would return, but they never did. The Ghost crew would relocate to Yavin 4 to continue the fight. Losing Kanan and Hera was already a tough burden to bear for the Ghost crew, but they had to keep going. Considering the Alliance seemed to be finally coming together thanks to Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, the arrival to Yavin was a bit bittersweet. They were applauded for assisting in the fall of the Imperial presence over Lothal, especially because it made the Alliance look stronger than it really was. The disappearance of Thrawn was a godsend, considering how cripplingly inept Imperial officers tend to be. Though for someone like former ISB agent Callus, he knew that was wrong. 7 people left and only 5 returned, aside from the clones and the few others that assisted on Lothal. Though the main Ghost crew actually left with 7 and returned with 6, it was just a secret. Titus was the first to find out. Hera and Kanan were going to have a child together. Titus took this information very heavily. It was because Kanan should have been here to be here with Hera, and she was incredibly important to the Alliance, though Titus was more concerned with how she was handling the situation. Truthfully, it was hard for Hera. She loved Kanan with all of her heart. She always did and she always will, but her role was to lead within the Alliance, and she would not stop. And she wouldn't stop doing that until she was physically unable to. She told Titus because she knew that She told Titus because she knew that he wouldn't try to stop her. Sabine and Zeb might, but Titus, being the oldest of the group, knew that Hera didn't want her new responsibility to weigh her down. She just wanted a friend to know about it. Though, of course, it would become eventually increasingly noticeable, considering not long after the Siege of Lothal she was entering her final trimester. And who couldn't ask for more perfect timing, all things considered? The Alliance just learned about a super weapon with the ability to destroy an entire planet, not to mention that only a day before it launched an attack on Jeddah and destroyed the entire ancient city of Jeddah City. Currently, as far as Titus knew, Cassian Andor and the daughter of the Death Star lead scientist Galen Erso, Jyn, were going to get the plans for the Death Star. The entire Rebel base was on high alert. This was because the Alliance fleet moved away from the Messina System and grouped up over Yavin 4. Admiral Raddus, in support of Rogue One, was forming up an attack fleet to strike at Scarif to assist the rebels of the rebels. Titus tried to warn Hera against fighting in this battle, feeling that there was something off, but she wasn't going to miss it, telling him that he could either help out or continue to bug her. Fair enough. Titus got the message and joined Hera, Chopper, and Rex on the Ghost, and assisted with the rebel attack over Scarif. When the Alliance arrived over Scarif, the battle was already underway on the ground. The present members of the Ghost crew manned all the weapons, while Hera brilliantly flew through the combat of the firefight. The Ghost was already a notable villain in the eyes of the Empire, and seeing it here told them more than anything that these rebels were growing. They were stronger than originally anticipated. Titus was shocked at the prowess of Hera during the battle. She was near giving birth, and she was piloting around the battlefield better than the best of the best ace pilots the galaxy had ever seen. Titus called over on the comm link, reporting the destruction of 2 Star Destroyers. He was manning the back cannons on the Ghost. He saw the 2 Star Destroyers slam down into each other, creating a massive destruction that crushed through the shield gate. When the gate opened, Jyn Erso on the ground was able to transmit the data for the Death Star to Admiral Raddus' flagship. Titus looked down at his console. It was beeping incredibly fast. Hera called up to him to ask if he was seeing anything. Chopper communicated through the radio, telling them that something massive was emerging from hyperspace. Rex and Titus met up in the main cockpit where Hera was as she piloted the ship over the stern and across the top of the flagship. The three of them paused when a superstructure emerged from hyperspace. For all of an entire instant, the galaxy felt still. The battle was silent as hundreds of rebel fighters watched in awe. It was the largest vessel anyone had ever seen, and it was powering up. The rebels watched as a massive green laser flashed across the rim of the dish. The lights converged and came together, shooting a massive blast down to the planet of Scarif, where the Imperial base was. Hera, Titus, and Rex watched in awe and in terror as the ground on Scarif ripped apart, blasting pieces and chunks of the planet into the sky. The three of them couldn't believe what the Empire had built. A massive communication came over the comms telling all rebel ships to evacuate the battlefield. As the rebels made their way for the escape, jumping into hyperspace, a Star Destroyer exited from hyperspace, tearing through vulnerable vessels on the way out. It was Vader's flagship. The vessel then began to fire its heavy turbo lasers into the rebel flagship and support ships. The Ghost was nearly hit by the Devastator as it emerged from hyperspace, but Hera was good enough of a pilot to get out of the way before her and her friends were obliterated. The last thing they heard was the sound of the crew of the support Hammerhead Corvette cry out for help. The jump into hyperspace was silent. The three of them didn't say a word, each of them falling back onto a separate chair, with a gouge in their hearts. The Empire built the unthinkable. What they were capable of was terror, and that terror could very easily control the will of the galaxy. Titus closed his eyes. He heard the same breathing that he heard on Malachor. He heard the cries of men, and all he could do was hope that the Alliance would be able to get a hold of the Death Star plans and escape. If they didn't, then they would lose. As the three of them sat in silence, Hera jolted from her seat and moved away from the other two, excusing herself from the group. Her grumpy little droid followed her. Titus stared into hyperspace, watching the lines barrel in towards them. Rex turned over and asked if he was alright. Titus slowly turned his head and nodded his head, telling him that the Force was speaking to him. Rex paused and asked what it was saying. He had a similar experience with Ahsoka shortly before the execution of Order 66. Titus took a deep breath, as if the air was being taken out of his lungs, and then he flung himself to his feet. The Force was awry. Everything was moving. But there was something happening inside the Ghost. Rex almost fell off his seat in his old age, and asked what was wrong. Titus ran forward and tripped over a chair and slammed into the door. Falling over his feet, he got back up, as Rex asked again what was wrong. Titus knocked on Hera's room, and she told them they could come in. She had gone into labor, and a couple minutes later, she had herself a son that would remind her of the man she fell in love with. The stress of the battle over Scarif was overwhelming, and the sights of the Death Star encroaching on the battle pushed her a little too far over the edge, and she was forced into labor early. It was a very painful process, but after she gave birth, she was wiped out, emotionally and physically exhausted. So Rex and Titus decided to try and find a means of making sure she was medically taken care of. Chopper could only do so much in the way of helping her out, though they had to wait until they got out of hyperspace, which according to their coordinates was off near Polis Massa. Luckily, according to Rex, Polis was a safe place, unused by the Empire, and simply a large asteroid that had a medical base on it. Titus found this to be perfect information. Truthfully, Rex used this location back in the early days of the Empire, when he and his clone brothers were taking the fight back to them. He never thought he'd be back. It was a hard place for him to go to because he lost a lot of his surviving brothers here. Titus told Rex that he could handle the entire thing for him. Rex thought about it and thanked Titus, telling him that going down on the Polis would be very far too emotional for him to handle, especially after Scarif and the birth of the child now known as Jason. When the Ghost landed on Polis, Titus got permission to carry Jason down into the facilities to make sure everything was alright with him. He was a premature baby, but it wasn't like super duper premature, so it shouldn't in reality be a big deal. When Titus got down to the facilities, he told them that a medical droid was needed inside the vessel, and 2 droids immediately took their supplies and boarded the ship to take care of Hera. At the same time, Jason was put into an infant's pod and taken into a medical room. Titus stood alone for a short period of time, focusing on the Force. He couldn't really feel much. The darkness was more present than even after Order 66. It felt like a culmination of the rise of the Empire was complete. Maybe the rebellion had failed. Maybe that's all it was. After Scarif, it wasn't hard to believe, with the Death Star and Vader's arrival over what was previously a successful victory, that the Alliance could fall. When the droids were done, Titus took Jason in a small pod back to the Ghost. As he was walking up the steps, he stopped. Rex was waiting for him at the top of the ramp, and he saw Titus slowly fall to the ground. Titus kept his hand on the pod to make sure that the child didn't go anywhere. Titus's knees hit the ground and his heart swelled. The Force was darker than ever before. When it got dark, it apparently could get worse. He never felt such pain, a painful death in the Force, not from Naboo, Geonosis, Mimban, or even after Order 66. He heard it, as if a billion voices cried out in terror, and then they were all silenced. Titus knew it was the Death Star, but the hole in his heart crippled him. Rex ran down the ramp and yelled out, asking what was wrong, to which Titus heaved, coughing on his own breath. Rex got under his arm and held him up, asking what it was. Titus choked and choked, squinting his eyes and breaking a sweat. He was gripping the pod with all his strength, and he kept shying away from the words. Rex asked what it was as he helped him situate himself. Titus looked up, seeing a shadow creeping down the ramp of the ship. It was Hera. Titus stopped his thought and told Rex to get Hera back to her bed. Rex turned around and rushed up the ramp and reached out his arms, telling Hera that he would take her back to her bedroom. Titus got back to his feet and shook off his feelings, still feeling the itching chill crawl down his spine. He pushed the pod up the ramp and took Jason to Hera's room so that she could lay next to him. Chopper was sitting in the room next to Hera. He looked over the child and then back at Hera, who was laying down ready to pass out. Titus told the droid that if they needed anything, then Chopper should contact them. The droid made a grumble and then the 2 of them left the room. Titus and Rex got to the cockpit and prepared themselves. They were heading back to Yavin to regroup with the rest of the Alliance. The ship lifted off and leapt into hyperspace. The moment it did, Rex closed the door behind the 2 of them and asked Titus what had happened. The Jedi turned his head and told Rex that he wouldn't believe him if he told him. Rex asked him to explain, and so he did. Titus closed his eyes. It was like he was on the planet. He could see the blue skies and the green grass. When he looked up into the sky, he could see the light of the sun and then the shadow that followed it. There was a large object in the sky that covered the sun, and when the sounds of crying and screaming began, a large light began to glow from a massive space station, and then there was silence. Titus told Rex that this didn't just destroy a city, but it likely was the destruction of the entire planet. Rex couldn't muster up the strength to say a word. He just looked with shock in his face. His skin turned pale and he leaned back in his seat. Titus asked Rex if he was alright, to which he nodded his head and got up. Rex said he'd be in the main bay if he was needed. Titus nodded his head and watched as Rex left the room. Titus got up from the main pilot seat, which was typically belonging to Hera, and moved over into another seat, simply out of respect for her ship. He sat there, isolated, and thought back on what the Bendu said to him 2 years beforehand, every word echoing through his heart, every intended message riding on the back of his head. Chopper beeped into the room, looking at Titus and sitting himself down in front of him. Titus and Chopper had a short conversation, more than anything simply understanding each other. They'd known each other for a little bit more than a decade at this point, and they simply had a calm conversation. Chopper too was curious about why Titus acted off, and he also wanted to give Hera some space with her child. The droid and the Jedi's conversation lasted for a little bit, before Chopper moved to the side and powered down. Titus put his hand on Chopper's head and leaned back against the seat and fell into a deep rest. His mind was taken away. Inside of his mind, he could hear a young boy cry out a terrible no. When the voice turned over, a robe drifted to the ground and Darth Vader stood over it. As the dream continued, he saw a number of X-Wings jolting towards space from Yavin. There was something about this boy, and then he heard a voice call out to the boy, calling him Luke, telling him to use the Force. This kid was special, but why? Titus jolted from his sleep and opened his eyes to the sound of beeping. His heart jumped out of his chest and the ghost rocketed out of hyperspace. Titus's bloodshot eyes were met with the fires of 1,000 suns in front of him. Inside of his chest, he could feel the deaths of millions. He leapt from his seat and into Hera's as he piloted the ship out of the way. Chopper jolted up and wheezed around trying to figure out what was happening as Titus slid the ghost into the right to avoid slamming into debris of the destruction. Chopper flipped into the wall and yelled some expletives at Titus. The Jedi told the facetious droid to simmer down as he whipped the ship through miles of debris. Titus held one of his eyes open while barely squinting with the other. His cloudy vision was a result of the deep sleep. Luckily, he had the Force as his ally to guide him through this. Once he got through, he saw a group of starfighters heading back towards Yavin. Behind them was a large Corellian fighter. Titus asked Chopper if he recognized the ship. The droid shook his head and then changed his mind, reminding him of one of the stories Lando told him about a kid named Han Solo who took a starship in a game of Sabacc. Titus nodded his head and followed the ships down to the surface of Yavin. When they got there, it was a massive celebration. But Titus wasn't worried about that. He ran over to Hera's side and made sure she was alright. Truthfully, the exhaustion of the last couple days was enough to keep her out, and so she was perfectly fine. Titus made sure Jason was alright and then got down into the base to get a medical droid into the ghost to make sure Hera was fine. When he got out, he saw a guy wearing a vest and a Wookiee run into the hangar bay. Titus was making sure Hera and Jason were taken care of and would join the rebels in a ceremony as they congratulated the victors of the rebellion's victory over the Death Star. The names rang out from Leia Organa's mouth: Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. It had to be a coincidence. There was no conceivable way it was at all possible. How could it be? Surely there was others in the galaxy named Skywalker, but then he realized it was the boy from his dream. This young man was strong with the Force. Titus took his mind off of it for a short while. He would ask the boy if he knew of the Force once the ceremony was over. After an hour or two, Titus would get a chance. He was familiar with rebel higher-ups, considering he was technically one of them, just by being a part of the Ghost Crew and as a former Jedi and commander. Regardless, Titus came up and asked if he could talk to Luke. Before he could finish the sentence, he saw a weapon sitting on his belt. It was a weapon of a Jedi, but not just any Jedi. There were many different variants of popular lightsaber styles. Skywalker used a style hilt that was fairly popular, considering Grievous collected his own version of the weapon. However, this one belonged to Anakin Skywalker, so either Luke was impersonating Skywalker, or he was a son of the hero of the Republic. Still, at this point, Titus was unaware that Vader was Anakin, and only assumed that Anakin died inside the Jedi Temple, defending it from clone troopers. Titus picked up his conversation, noticing the awkward look that Skywalker was giving him because of the silence. Titus carried on, telling Luke that he would like a chance to talk to him alone, if he had the time. Luke nodded his head, and so the two of them walked out of the massive structure. Titus told Luke that he was a Jedi, to which Luke perked up. Titus told him that he had trained a couple Jedi in his time, and he was curious if Luke had the ability to use the Force. Luke stopped, and Titus did too, noticing a bit of pain behind Luke's eyes. The young Skywalker told Titus that Obi-Wan Kenobi told him that the Force flew through him. Titus was taken aback. Ezra went and searched for Kenobi, but reported to never find him. It was a lie on Ezra's part to keep Kenobi safe from the rest of the rebels, but Titus was shocked that someone like Obi-Wan had lived for so long. The last he heard of Obi-Wan was the sacrifice at Jabim, and he was incredibly shocked to learn that Kenobi was able to survive his encounter with Vader. Regardless, Luke told Titus that his father was Anakin Skywalker. He wanted to be a Jedi, just like his father. Titus nodded his head, and told Luke that Anakin Skywalker was an incredible man, but if Luke wanted to learn the ways of the Force, then Titus would be willing to teach him, as long as Luke was willing to learn. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Bendu and Wells, Tiger Boy, Jack Miller, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Flynn Vassis, Apollo, Jedi Sloth, Mad Matty Studios, Anakin003, Lemon Knight, and Lord Denwing for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. If you want to support the channel other ways, check out the Patreon. Links are down below. Otherwise, part 9 will be out next Saturday. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.